My name's Vilsoni Hereniko, and I'm the director of the Oceania Center for Arts, Culture and Pacific Studies at the University of the South Pacific in Suva, Fiji. Prior to that, I was the director of the Center for Pacific Studies at the University of Hawaii. I think what I have seen in the last 2 days have been very provocative in some ways. It makes you wonder and makes you think. And I find myself making comparisons with indigenous peoples in Hawaii, in Fiji, in other parts of the world where it's very difficult to hang on to your culture, given the fact that everything is so commercial these days, and you need money to make a living. So how do you maintain integrity in terms of portraying your culture when the marketplace, the forces of commercialism, are forcing you to perhaps, cater more to the needs of the marketplace and not so much the needs of your own soul, the needs of your own people. And I wonder if Taiwan has been able to find the right balance. Maybe it is, but I'd like to know more.
Yeah, I think there is a need at a regional level. This is why I think Taiwan's maybe contribution to the indigenous struggle is to try and unite, Oceania, right, with all its many islands, with all its many leaders. We were talking about a leader who could emerge that would, bring together everybody and to discuss issues of concern, like how do indigenous people survive in the modern world? How can we make that happen? Because I think at the end of the day, indigenous people are like peoples anywhere else. They want to have food at the table, and they want to ensure that their children, their families have access to good education, they have access to good health, they're happy, It's hard to be happy if you have an empty stomach. So those basic concerns need to be addressed, and yet at the same time, none of these islands is there on its own. It's all connected through the ocean, whatever, to the larger nations. So how do you talk to those people, right, and relate to them in ways that will lead to respect, will lead to the dignity of your own people, right? And maybe, I wish someone in Taiwan meets these qualifications we have been talking about and try and unite indigenous peoples in Oceania to address these issues of leadership, of politics, and the economy, and maybe we can all work together and find a solution to these challenges that I think are the same for indigenous peoples, everywhere. I think arts and culture is the quickest and most effective way to do it. If, say, Taiwan were to host the Festival of Pacific Arts in 2016, after the Solomon Islands, and bring together all these, various practitioners of the art forms and dance and music and wood carving, and then look at all the art here, painters, for example, the way indigenous artists draw from the past with their mythologies, but create contemporary works that speak to the issues of the day. I think if Taiwan were to host that festival, that would be so effective, and it would also make indigenous peoples outside Taiwan aware that they have, a common origin. We were to believe that indigenous people came from, whether it's Southeast Asia as well as Taiwan as well as South China. I think it doesn't really matter, but we all agree that they came somehow, right, from Asia, right? And I personally believe that Taiwan is also, the homeland of a lot of, indigenous peoples who moved out. That, I think, would emphasize our commonalities rather than our differences. We all share the Pacific Ocean, which is wide and, washes the shores of Taiwan as well as the shores of those islands in the Pacific. So that, I would say, is the most effective way, through art and culture. The other way is through the ocean, as custodians of the ocean, to nurture the ocean, to figure out how we can ensure that those resources continue to be passed on to our young people and children who are yet to be born, I think climate change is an issue that's affecting, not just those smaller islands in the Pacific, but Taiwan as well. And I think if the ocean continues to be the main focus of, Taiwan and the other islands in the Pacific, we certainly have, the same issues, the same concerns. Well, I think the secret to all this is ensuring that indigenous people have control over their own representations. The minute you lose control, then you are at the mercy of the larger forces, whether it's capitalism or whether it's the nation state. And this is why I think the question of whether indigenous people in a place like Hawaii, in a place like Taiwan, should struggle to have sovereignty, which means having control over your resources, over your representations, the images that are created, or whether indigenous people should continue to survive within the nation state, which means the nation would have more control over what's going on. And I think that's an issue that all indigenous peoples face in Hawaii, where I've been for the past 20 years. The political activists are torn between the idea of a nation within a nation, right? So Hawaiians would have, their own little nation within the bigger nation of the United States, or whether they should have complete autonomy and say, thank you very much, United States, but we want to run our own lives and we want to be in control of our own resources. And so a lot of indigenous people are torn between having half a loaf and saying, no, thank you, I won't have half a loaf, I want the whole loaf. And until you prepare to give me the whole loaf, I'm not going to eat with you. And I think it's a very tough one, and maybe it's one that the indigenous tribes of Taiwan are perhaps wondering about, because a lot of indigenous tribes or people don't know whether they can make it on their own without the largesse, without the support of the nation state. And that's a very tricky one. But coming back to your question, I think as long as you are in control, you can determine what happens. And if it doesn't work, well, you have yourself to blame at the end of the day. You can't blame the colonizer or the nation state. But I think at the end of the day, for me, it's most important that native people, indigenous people, have control over their resources. And how you get to that place is the issue. Watching the performances last night, and also the experiences, that I had last year, seem to suggest that maybe one difference here amongst the Taiwanese tribes is the fact that, they live very close to the mountains. They have access to the natural environment here, which a lot of native people elsewhere do not have. The mountains that have been taken over, And I think that has allowed the tribes here to have better control over their own way of life. Last night we had someone talking about being able to go out and hunt and see deer and stuff. Most native peoples in Hawaii and other places don't even have access to their lands. Their lands have been taken away. They've been dispossessed. They're homeless. They're under tents by the beach. So it's very different. So those people have a harder time trying to hang on to, their land even, and as well as their own representation. So what we experienced last night was a genuineness that for many people outside, Taiwan, say in Hawaii, for example, people are jaded by the tourists. They are finding it very hard to continue to perform and talk about their culture, and so they become cynical. They do it because they need the money, but as soon as people leave, they just couldn't wait to have them depart, And what I saw so far, it seems to me that the Taiwanese tribes are not jaded yet, because they have better control over their own representations, how they do things. They have access to the forest, to the land. They're eating, vegetables. The other day, they were showing you can eat this, that. Native Hawaiians, many of them, you go to Waianae, they are right there on the beach, homeless. No lands to speak of, no access. So
People have become very disillusioned, very cynical, and they've given up the fight. Many of them. It's like, why even bother? There's no way you can win this. But over here, I think it's a little different, and in some ways the tribes here are quite lucky. And I say that with great reservation, knowing that all is not rosy, that, until people have sovereignty over their own lives, they're not completely free and happy. Even if you as a community say, okay, we are going to make these compromises because we need the money, and we'll sell a little bit of our soul, and knowing that that's the only way we can survive, in the market economy. But as long as they themselves made that decision, it's not one that's imposed from outside, then I think people can still hold their head up, and because they know that they cannot blame the colonizer or anyone else for their own situation. So I think cultural autonomy, as opposed to cultural authenticity, I think is more important. It's more important to have cultural autonomy as a people than to be say, we will be so authentic, but you don't have cultural autonomy, and I think that's the way to go.